Hi, so this is a lecture on Martin Luther King, and specifically on his letter from Birmingham jail. I'm only going to talk about some details from that piece of writing, because I figure that most people, I'm sure that all of you actually know who Martin Luther King is. So general comments on King, and then I'm going to get straight into this content, and I'm just going to talk about direct action, specifically nonviolent direct action, just and unjust laws. I think that's the main stuff. So everybody knows who Martin Luther King was. Civil rights leader, killed in 1968, in large part responsible for what becomes civil rights legislation under Johnson, and heroic individual that everybody knows, associated with nonviolence. One thing that I would say is be aware that the celebrity of Martin Luther King, the saintly character of Martin Luther King was produced. You know, the perception that the general public, that the general American public in particular, has about Martin Luther King as a kind of saint, and of his nonviolent policies, which in large part he derives from Gandhi and from, in a lot of ways, from Henry David Thoreau. The idea that he's just a saintly individual who does things in the right nonviolent way and who deserves our respect and should be a model for the African American community, for other communities, all that stuff is constructed after he gets killed. Before he's killed, his public reception, his media portrayal, the evaluation of him made by the government was quite different. He was a dangerous man. He was under FBI scrutiny. He was, I would say, probably killed by one or another government entity. And the fact that afterwards, now, same thing for Cesar Chavez, these two non-violent actors now have all kinds of stuff named after them, right? I think just about every city that I've lived in has a Martin Luther King Boulevard. We have one here, right? There was one in New Orleans. There was one in, I think there's one in Philadelphia, one in Chicago. These are places that I've lived. That's constructed afterwards. King is, and James Baldwin is going to talk in particular about this. The James Baldwin text that we have is immediately in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's shooting, his assassination, at which point there were rebellions in dozens of United States cities. King was killed, and then King was rehabilitated. And Baldwin will say that his rehabilitation, his being reconstructed as this docile, gentle, acceptable, noble role model, and then distributed in all these ways to children and schools and so on. That idea that he's an acceptable person, that he's a good person, that even the government and its institutions, which includes education, can freely distribute his image and his gospel. That all happens afterwards. When he's still alive, he is perceived as a threat, and he probably really was a threat. And it's worth recognizing also that while we're looking at this, this is a classic piece of literature, the letter from Birmingham jail. Well-known, worldwide known piece of literature. But in the couple of years after that, King starts to shift his focus, and he starts to shift it from specifically, issues about segregation and voting rights, with an aim of just integration. That's what he's a reformer. He's not a revolutionary. He's a reformer at that point. But by the end of his life, he's starting to say, well, wait a minute. First of all, and this is a bit of the movement from civil rights to black power. Maybe integration isn't the only thing that we're aiming at here. Maybe we can no longer criticize, and King actually says this towards the end of his life, maybe we can no longer criticize those young black men who throw rocks at cop cars, who engage in these kind of minimal and spontaneous acts of violence towards their oppressors. King, towards the end of his life, starts to say, I don't think I can criticize that anymore. Of course, he doesn't champion it. That's not what he thinks is the solution, but he becomes much more understanding of it. And the other thing that he does is he shifts his critical gaze from the Civil Rights Forum to a broader forum, which now included the Vietnam War. He becomes anti-war. And this is the point at which he gets killed. So he was dangerous beforehand. He was under FBI scrutiny beforehand. He gets more radical. He was moving, and Malcolm was moving towards him. They're moving into a kind of potentially shared territory, and then he gets killed. That's important to think about. Okay, so everybody knows that Martin Luther King is associated with nonviolence. Everybody knows that King led these large actions in places like Selma and Birmingham, where tremendous numbers of African American people and their supporters turned out to engage in forms of civil disobedience in order to put pressure on southern state governments to abide by civil rights desegregation legislation that had already happened in the 1950s. Let's talk about that concept of direct action, first of all. So King, in the letter from Birmingham jail, of course he writes this letter, he's in jail, and he's in jail technically for parading without a permit. So he says, that's a fine law in general, that you ought to have a permit to parade. But if that law is used to prohibit full human integration of full human beings, it becomes a bad law. So he's defending his breaking of that law. And while he's in Birmingham jail, he writes this letter, which then gets smuggled out. Now, he's not the only person in this class to have smuggled out literature from jail. At least Ngugi wa Thiong'o does the same thing, although at much longer length and on toilet paper. Anyway, so the letter from Birmingham jail, it lists off how King really understands the appropriate kind of action to obtain alteration of relationships of domination within a society. And he talks about how this should be done. We have to prepare ourselves. We have to purify ourselves. And this is all because he's thinking about nonviolent action, which requires, and Gandhi thinks this way too, requires a profound degree of, they would probably say, spiritual strength. But I want to talk about direct action. So this is what they're preparing for, is direct action. But the category of direct action is bigger than the category of nonviolence. Nonviolence is one variety of direct action. So I want to make really clear what direct action is. This is also what Henry David Thoreau had recommended. And in a certain way, even though there's a pretty strong contrast between the last piece of reading, Frantz Fanon, and this one from Martin Luther King. They're together because they're chronologically close. Fanon is understood, generally speaking, as an advocate, at least a defender, of violent action, military action, full-on revolutionary violence. And King is the opposite, right? King is always urging nonviolent action until he pauses a little bit towards the end of his life. But you could say that even the kind of action that Fanon is recommending, even the killing of white settlers in Algeria or in Angola or in Kenya, that's direct action too. So direct action is quite a wide category, and I want to try to define it. Direct action has to be distinguished from indirect action. We are trained, we are urged in a whole lot of ways not to take things into our own hands. Hannah Arendt talks about this too. She's like, that's maybe the distinctive feature of a revolutionary period, is that for once, people actually do things for themselves. For the most part, we are trained not to. And those of us who have some problem with the way that things are set up, we are urged, okay, you have a problem with, say, deportation policies. I'm going to come back to those. Present deportation policies, if you ask me, are a big damn problem. They're racist, they're unjust, they break up families, they empower police, they can lead towards like an ever greater police state, if you ask me. So those of us who have some kind of opposition to laws like that, one or another procedure, or say, I have a problem with the whole prison industrial complex. The fact that prisons can be run for profit, that's just sick, if you ask me. That's like real close to slavery. The military industrial complex. The fact that we spent 7 times as much we spend as much money on arms as the next 7 nations combined. The fact that we spend so much more into the military industrial complex than we do into education. I have a problem with all this stuff. I have lots of problems. Okay, so I'm some kind of bleeding heart liberal, is the way that I would initially appear. And maybe one thing that distinguishes a liberal is that they follow the urging not to do anything about it themselves. We are urged to engage in action, but only in direct action. Okay, so you care about these things? You should be voting in every election. You should be writing letters to your congresspeople. Perhaps you should be visiting with your congresspeople. You can get involved in different organizations and groups which apply pressure to representatives. This is the kind of action that we are urged to do, and by its nature, this action is indirect. Indirect meaning that we are not going to make the change, we're going to ask somebody else to make the change. We're going to beg somebody else to make the change. At best, perhaps we're going to try to pressure a representative to make the change with the idea that perhaps if they don't make this change, enough people will be dissatisfied with them that they won't get reelected. At best, we put pressure on a representative, but we never, on this model, actually go and fix the thing that is wrong ourselves. Or go back to King's period, segregation. There are plenty of well-meaning white folk, at least well-meaning to some level. Probably there's even well-meaning black folk who, nevertheless, do not think that it is their responsibility, their place, their right to do anything about it directly. Rather, they think that they should write a letter to their congressperson and say, hey, you know, these segregation laws, they don't seem right to me. I think that African American people are protected by the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence just like everybody else. They're human just like everybody else. They should, exactly like everybody else. They should use the same bathrooms and they should sit at the same counters. I'm sure there were people that wrote letters to their congresspeople, and this was indirect action. You might remember that Thoreau says, like, I wasn't born for this shit. Like, I'm not going to waste my time begging people. It's not my job to beg people. But he said, it is my job to withdraw myself from the evil as best I can, or to interrupt the evil, to stop the evil having its own machine. That is my responsibility. So, even though Martin Luther King is understood as a pacifist, as a gentle man and a patient man, and Stokely Carmichael even will talk about him like this, nevertheless, you have to recognize that he's a pushy man. He's not just following the system. He is aiming for most of his life at integration within the system. So that's a reformer position, and it sort of affirms various things that other revolutionaries we're reading in this class would not affirm. Maybe capitalism is okay, although again, at the end of his life, it seems to me that Martin Luther King was starting to question the ethical merit of capitalism too. But at any rate, he's not just asking his congressperson for something. He's doing something himself. This is direct action. Very broadly, direct action is when you identify a problem and then you figure out, what can I do to remedy that problem? So, for example, once you have and this is more in connection with the Cesar Chavez stuff, but bear with me. Once you have what is called a business union at a place of employment, business union meaning one that is oriented towards contracts and mediates relationships between workers and management, constantly compromising and moving incrementally to nominally improve the livelihoods of workers, etc. Once you have that union, that type of union in place in a shop, what happens when somebody doesn't like something is that they go through a grievance procedure. So here's an example. Say we work in a machine shop, and it's wintertime, and there's a window way up on top of the shop that's a set of them that are open, and it's just freezing in there. And so we call our union rep over, and we say, hey man, the window's open, it's freezing in here. We've all got our jackets on, and like this sucks. This is not good working condition. We need those windows closed. So the union representative files a grievance, And the grievance goes through a procedure that can be 6 months to a year. Say it takes 6 months. Of course, it's a metaphorical story, but it gets the point. Finally, after 6 months, the management comes in and like, okay, we want to help you guys out. So they go and they close the windows. But at this point, it's the middle of summer, and it's hot as hell. And now the winter problem is gone, and they just produce a summer problem. And so a new grievance can be filed, etc., etc., etc. That's indirect action. That's appealing to the management to fix the problem for you, which is what business unions generally require, which is a problem with those kind of unions. There are other kinds of unions, by the way. There are what I would call solidarity unions, unions which insist upon action, direct action in the workplace. That's the kind of union I support. Direct action is very simple. The windows up at the top of the shop are open and everybody's freezing. Let's find a ladder and let's go close them. We don't need to ask anyone. That is direct action versus indirect action. So what King is recommending is a variety of direct action. The way that he puts it is, we're going to put our bodies on the line. We're going to use our bodies to make the case. So what's an example of direct action in King's case? Well, there's Rosa Parks. Black people are prevented from sitting in certain seats on a bus, so she goes and takes that seat. That's a demonstration. That's direct action. Now, it's not just direct action. It's also got a whole kind of propagandistic dimension to it, because if nobody ever saw that she did that, or only the people on the bus ever saw that she did that, it would not have achieved its goal, really, right? It needed to be publicized. It was also a statement. But at its ground level, it's direct action, meaning that something's wrong. Certain classes of people are forbidden the rights that everybody else has. And instead of begging some authority to take care of it, Rosa Parks sits down and fixes it herself. Same thing for protests at lunch counters. So black people were prohibited from eating at certain places, right? What civil rights direct action did was say, we do not accept this segregation law. We don't accept that we're not allowed to eat there. We're going to eat there. And here we are, we're sitting here. Direct action. They've used their bodies to directly remedy whatever the problem was. Now, nonviolent. Some direct action could be violent, right? I mean, in principle, if you go straight to the root of the problem, you're still engaged in direct action. Here's another example. Let's say there's a problem with the growth of white power groups in our country. That's a fact. Let's say that in some cases, white power groups are coming into communities and onto campuses. This is a fact, right? So the UCs, they were at, which Cal State was it? Maybe Cal State Long Beach recently, Milo Yiannopoulos, Richard Spencer, people like this. They come onto campuses, they come into communities, and of course this debate is framed as a debate about free speech. But the problem we have to recognize is that when organized KKK, neo-Nazi groups are in communities, they're also intimidating people, and they're beating people. Black people, queer people, trans people. This is a problem. There are two ways to go about solving such a problem. For one, we can appeal to the authorities. We can ask campus police, we can ask the president, we can ask our representatives, we can ask the police, etc. Please take care of this. This sucks. And then there's another way to go about dealing with the problem of white power groups intimidating and beating people, and that is to form Antifa, anti-fascist blocks, to meet force with force. Now, there's a lot of debate, even on the left, there's a lot of debate about whether Antifa is a wise movement or not. But regardless of whether it's wise, and the reason it might not be is because maybe physical conflicts between leftists and fascists actually fulfills a fascist agenda. Maybe there are strategic reasons to try to avoid this stuff. But one way or the other, that's direct action. And in that case, direct action could be violent. You see my point? So what King is into is one variety of direct action, and that variety is technically nonviolent. The other thing I want to add to this, though, is that while it is nonviolent and that anything that King had a role in organizing or overseeing, or that he committed himself to, never involved attacking and harming other people. And specifically, the people in question here would really have been the police, because you'll see the police beat the shit out of protesters in Birmingham, protesters in Selma. So the question was not whether people were going to attack the police. The question was whether they were going to physically defend themselves as they were beaten. And they consciously and intentionally made the choice not to do so. So King was nonviolent in this respect. And of course, there's a whole gamble going on here. Stokely Carmichael is going to talk about this. He's like, okay, Stokely is the first person to use the term Black Power. It's thought of in a lot of ways as like one of the originators of the Black Power movement. And Black Power is typically distinguished from the Civil Rights period, even though they're completely continuous, because there's this shift away from nonviolence, which doesn't mean that like Black Power has everything to do with hyper-violence or that it is pro-violent. It's just that it refuses to say, well, if I'm beaten, I'm just going to sit there. That's the difference. But when Stokely's commenting on MLK, he says, this whole idea that we're going to have nonviolent protest rests on an idea about sympathy and conscience. The idea is that these spiritually prepared people who really, and I mean, Gandhi wrote about this too, it's really hard to sit and be beaten without responding. It's not natural. This requires a certain variety of self-overcoming. And so perhaps it requires a kind of like spiritual practice. Maybe it is a spiritual practice. That's how Gandhi thought of it. And in place without these religious traditions, it won't work. King was trying to carry out this spiritual practice, but there's a practical dimension which requires that, first of all, that what happens to the nonviolent protesters will be broadcast to a significant population. So think about like Standing Rock. Some of us have seen what police and security personnel did to nonviolent protesters at Standing Rock, but most people didn't. Most of that really horrible stuff with the dogs, it was kept out of the mainstream media, or it only appeared very briefly. It'll be distributed. It assumes that there's this distribution, but it also assumes that when this stuff is distributed, it will produce a moral response. That if you show the ruling authority to be unjust and violent, you'll get a response out of the general public, which will force that ruling authority to mend its path, to change the way that it proceeds. And Stokely's response to that is like, MLK made only one fallacious assumption, and that is, in order for nonviolence to work, your opponent or the country you're in must have a conscience. The United States has none. This is his idea. Okay, the thing that I wanted to say was that though MLK was nonviolent and advocated for this robust and thought through nonviolent method, this does not mean that he was not playing with force. He was actually using a variety of force. It just wasn't a bludgeon to another man's head. It was economic force. It was media and publicity force, and especially economic. So, for example, if you read the letter from Birmingham jail, King says, look, we originally scheduled to come down here on the biggest shopping day we could find. We wanted to shut down your city on this big shopping day in order to cost everybody money. So King's nonviolent, but he's applying pressure. The whole logic here about forcing the system to change and forcing it to integrate people who it previously kept down, this is going to happen through the use of a variety of force. Specifically, what King says is that, we tried negotiating first. We tried getting people to agree to take down their segregation signs, no black people served in this restaurant, that kind of thing. We tried to get people to agree. They said they'd do it. They didn't do it. Okay, we tried to negotiate, negotiation didn't work. So now we go to the action phase. Now we have direct action. We're going to do things in order to put pressure. So going to the counter is a clear example of direct action. Marching in the street, people call that direct action. I'm not sure if that's quite correct. But what it is directly doing is applying economic pressure. And the idea, King says, is to produce tension. You want to produce a situation which is uncomfortable, economically uncomfortable, visually uncomfortable, ethically uncomfortable. So these, like, the less racist or the more moral, the more thoughtful white folk walking around Birmingham now have to see, oh, all these people are unhappy. All these people are being discriminated against. Oh, I'm sort of a part of that. They're being forced into a tense situation, which is uncomfortable. And MLK's intent is to produce that discomfort. And then the idea is that by producing tension, you come back to negotiation, and maybe you get some of the things that you wanted before you did your action. That's the basic idea. Let's move on. The core, I think, of the letter from Birmingham jail is the distinction between just and unjust laws. King is trying to answer questions that were raised by other clergy who were not at all supportive of him. Like, why are you even here? Why did you come here? Like, what business do you have here? And he answers all these things in practical ways. And then they say, well, what gives you the right to decide what laws you're going to follow and what laws you're not going to follow? Isn't the whole point about a law that you don't get to decide? The legislators, they decided, and we believe that we have some kind of functional democratic process going on there. And it's not up to you. You don't get to decide whether you're going to abide by the deportation laws. If ICE shows up at your door and they want your uncle, you got to get the hell out of the way. King has a response, because King is clearly breaking the law, right? There are at least two varieties of law that he's breaking. There's the segregation laws, which he and everyone he's working with are breaking. What is it? The Southern Leadership Conference is his organization. They're breaking the segregation laws. And secondly, he broke this law about parading without a permit. Stupid little law, but often it's stupid little laws like that that are used to keep people from protesting, right? So he has to give an answer, and he gives this very principled and very thought through, and I would say classical answer to this question. I say classical because he even references these old philosophical and theological authorities in making his argument. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine. And what he says is like, well, look, there's two kinds of laws. First of all, the segregation laws that were being upheld in the southern states were illegal from a federal perspective. So he had like a legal argument there. The parading law, he says he's breaking that law because it's being used to uphold unjust laws. So the primary distinction is between just and unjust laws. And he gives us a list of ways of distinguishing between just and unjust laws. For one, this is the classical one coming from probably St. Augustine. He says, just laws square with the moral law. Unjust laws don't. So and this assumes that every human being, and I think Thoreau sort of assumes this thing too. I'm not sure. I think I agree with this on the most pragmatic level. Everybody, nearly everybody, really does know what's right and wrong. They know that it's wrong to discriminate. They know that it's wrong to beat people. They know that it's wrong to hurt others, and so on. So an unjust law is one that puts on the books something that everybody knows is wrong anyway. So segregation is an unjust law. Secondly, a just law uplifts human personality. It ennobles humans. It allows them to fulfill their potential. It recognizes their central traits, which can never be taken away from them, their freedom, their rationality, this sort of thing. Unjust law degrades human personality. It prevents certain people from being able to behave and develop themselves equally with others. So laws that prevent transgendered people from using bathrooms degrade human personality. So this is a pretty good distinction. And then he's like, okay, just laws have to be voted in by a majority, and the majority has to follow those laws too. But of course, if it was a majority, and really it was only a majority who were allowed to vote, who supported these segregation laws in the South, there's something unjust about that anyway, because they're establishing and enforcing laws which do not bear upon them. It only bears upon this minority over here. So that's an unjust law. Like any law that's going to be just has to bear upon everybody equally. If it doesn't affect me at all, I'm not transgendered, so I don't care if transgendered people can use bathrooms, and then I vote to disallow their going into the gender that they identify with. That's an unjust law because it bears upon them but not upon me. And then lastly, the minority has to have a role in making these laws. So he gives this full list of what distinguishes a just from an unjust law. Last point that King makes, he's like, look, it's totally possible to have legal activity, which is nevertheless evil. So in Hitler's Germany, it was illegal to hide Jews from the police, the SS, and as we talked about previously, even the Jewish councils that were rounding up Jews and sending them off to their death. It was, the law required that you hand that person over to go to their death. That was legal. But it's pretty impossible to suggest that, well, because it was legal, it was the right thing to do. Because it was legal, it's what I really should have done. My conscience and the law can really be at odds. And what Thoreau, Arendt, King think is that where your conscience leans one direction and the law goes the other, you got to choose your conscience. So, and I do think we have laws like this. I mean, I think that the deportation laws we now have in place are discriminatory, violent, racist, and so on. And so perhaps we have a responsibility, not just to engage in indirect action and to convince our representatives to somehow vote to back off ICE or to open up immigration policy, but perhaps we even have an obligation to engage in direct action, to interfere with the functioning of ICE or Border Patrol. And some people are preparing for that kind of direct action, civil disobedience. Get in between ICE or Border Patrol and the people that they want to deport and don't let them do it. That's direct action. Maybe we have a responsibility to do that sort of thing. Question is okay, do you agree that there are just but also unjust laws? And do you agree that where there are unjust laws, we have a responsibility to break those laws? I mean, Thoreau says this directly. Unjust laws exist. What shall we do? Immediately transgress them. Now that puts you in the line of fire, right? Like that makes you susceptible to consequences on a legal basis. And to go back to Thoreau and to King, it's probably not possible to be both ethical and comfortable. But do you agree that we have a right to distinguish between just and unjust laws? Because that, for a lot of legally minded people, that's a problem. The idea that I get to decide which laws I like and which ones I don't, that seems like a violation of the very nature of law. So there's a position that would suggest I have to follow laws no matter what. I have to hand over the Jews to the SS. I have to hand over my uncle to ICE. But then there is another position which is equally as understandable. And that one says, no, I have to do what I think is right. If I know that a law is unjust, I have to disobey it. I have to take direct action to impede its functioning. So my question to you is, do you agree with the distinction between just and unjust laws? Do you agree that you have a right and or a responsibility to distinguish between these types of laws? And lastly, do you agree that we have a certain moral obligation to break and to impede the functioning of laws which are unjust, like segregation?